We're 50 episodes old. Welcome to episode 50 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined for the 50th time by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hey there, sorry to interrupt you today, Kevin, but I do have a special surprise for our 50th episode. We are sponsoring this episode.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
So I got a little ad spot if you give me a second to read.
Absolutely.
All right. This episode of the Firewalls.com podcast is brought to you by Firewalls.com. So make sure to use our promo code there.
Yeah, all right. As we say, we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. And for the 50th time, please do rate and review us. Now, when I'm saying the 50th time on a lot of these, it's actually probably the 100th time or 99th time, because I do say something like this at the end of the episodes, too. Drop us a line anytime if you have a question, too, at podcast@firewalls.com, or, of course, in the comments on your favorite podcasting platform. As I've said 49 times before, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic for this episode. You may have picked up on it by now.
So, as you may have noticed, it's our 50th episode, and to celebrate Ping turning the Big 50, we thought we'd revisit some topics of significance from our past edition and offer some updates, some reactions, and maybe a new spin on some old subjects.
And while we could easily choose 50 or more topics to touch on, in the interest of time, we're going with 5. So topic number 1 is from our very first episode, titled Security in the Cloud, which dropped in August of 2019. It's significant because of how it foretold of a problem that simply exploded a few months down the road. So story number 1 today that we'll talk about, a new study from Nationwide Insurance has found that most small business owners let their employees work remotely, but they may not be taking the necessary steps to keep their cybersecurity strong. Andrew, what did you see in the study?
So just a few quick stats from the study. 83% of small businesses owners that were surveyed report that they do allow employees to work remotely when needed.
So that was the very first headline that we did on our very first episode. We were already seeing some projections of some concern potentially from the work from home side of things.
If only we had known what was coming. Exactly. Hopefully some people took our advice up front.
Yeah. So this was for people who were already businesses that were already starting to allow more employees to work from home. And even at that point, there were some concerns about security, but at least in those cases, there was a more controlled environment. And so they were able to maybe have a little bit more preparation involved in the working from home side of things. But then, of course, sort of the canary in the coal mine kind of story there.
Yeah, and I think really not just due to the pandemic, but the last couple of years in general have seen a lot of this experimentation of different types of work environments and schedules. You've got people trying out 4-day work weeks now. And now, of course, in the aftermath of COVID-19, you've still got businesses reckoning with whether they will bring people back to the office.
Yep.
So it seems that the workplace has changed quite a bit for multiple reasons over the last couple years. And obviously, we've seen how that has played out in the cybersecurity world.
Yeah, and some of the dangers that were enumerated in that particular story, and we've talked about since, there are dangers with employees. Back then, one of the top ones in that story was about using public Wi-Fi and things like that. Obviously, the different kind of work from home or work remote environment occurred with the pandemic, where not so many people were using public Wi-Fi necessarily, but that's still an issue now. And then, of course, whatever type of security setup your employee has at home, if they're not hooked onto your VPN all the time, if they don't have endpoint, if you don't have visibility into their activities, all sorts of things like that are still pretty big issues.
Right, and like you said, there wasn't quite as many people working from public Wi-Fi, working from home during that period, but I think there was a big impact on places like schools where, potentially students don't have internet connection at home, so they're either going to these mobile bus Wi-Fi Wi-Fi centers in parking lots, or as you said, just going to public Wi-Fi, McDonald's, or wherever their nearest hotspot is. So
yeah,
it's presented some different challenges based on different industry you might be trying to protect.
And so we talked about a lot of work from home dangers with this clip, and the next clip is sort of our first introduction to the work from home situation. So months down the road, we talked about August of 2019. This was our first episode. And I don't know if before we leave the first episode, any other reminiscences of the first? I know when I was listening back to it, I think we sound a little bit different.
I was going to comment on the fact that the audio quality has changed quite a bit, but now we're about to move into our first work from home episode, and it'll be a third completely different. So I imagine this show is going to include a lot of that.
Hopefully this next clip is the worst, the nadir of audio quality for for us in this one. So yes, this next episode was from March of 2020, which was episode 16. And this was right after really the world sort of shut down or went into lockdown state at the beginning of a more widespread look at the pandemic. And this was episode 16 titled Pod from Home.
We'd normally be set up in the Firewalls.com studio talking face-to-face, but we're podcasting from home because we're working from home. So if we seem more cold and distant toward each other on this episode, that's why. We're at the end of our second week of this setup, so we thought it'd be a good time to share some tales from home.
Pretty good audio quality right there, I think. Yeah,
we were young and afraid for our lives, and it's good times.
We did not ever miss an episode, though, even with all of that stuff swirling around us. That was right on time.
Yeah, we really powered through thanks to Zoom and microphones. I'm glad to be back in the studio and have a real microphone in front of me.
Yeah, I mean, the audio quality, I know we actually got one of the times we did one from home about the audio quality, and
we're sorry.
Apologies. Yes, we improved our audio quality even on the from home episodes after a while because we had a little bit more time to prepare, but certainly certain ones did not sound as good as we would like necessarily.
Right, but just kind of goes to show that everybody in their own ways out there found some way to carry on with whatever their normal was, maybe slightly altered, but
yeah.
You make it happen, whether that be securing a network or selling things to secure a network or just talking about it on a podcast.
Or just talking about stuff in general. And in fact, on that Pod From Home episode, we started off really just talking about how we were set up because, it's interesting to share how everyone is set up when they're working from home, especially for the first time and without a lot of preparation for it. Yeah, we were just joining the rest of the world. And I think it was important to provide that window and have that discussion sort of showing everyone that we're all in the same boat. And
right. And we got to see the show from our guest perspective. They were recording from home all along. So.
Yeah, that episode we talked about how we were set up, and we talked about some of those dangers or some of the things to prepare for as well for working from home, and we touched on those a bit already. I think now that we are a year and 4 months from that time frame, a lot of businesses have made strides in terms of how they've handled it. The scramble that happened initially was a common topic for us over the next several months because it was showing up so much in terms of cyber dangers that were out there. And certainly that danger has not subsided completely, right. but places have, I think, done a little bit better now in getting a handle on security.
Well, after 16 months of this, I hope we don't have to repeat anymore to use two-factor authentication and strong passwords, but I'll go ahead and for good measure, just throw one extra on there.
Yeah, doesn't hurt. So the undercurrent of the pandemic is always there, but we'll kind of move out of that kind of subject matter for our next clip, which was last summer. We had back-to-back episodes that focused on the diversity or lack thereof in cybersecurity careers. So in episode 24, cyber threat intelligence consultant Roderick Chambers from Blacks in Cybersecurity tells us why it matters.
From the human intelligence perspective, the best way to build a relationship with someone is to have a lot of diversity. Certain relationships are built, whether that's female or male, the age gap, those relationships are built, and you need to have a wide net of individuals that can capture those targets. That's the same thing in the cybersecurity world that we have.
So in this case, I don't know if you recall, but Roderick actually had a background in human intelligence first and then switched over to cyber threat intelligence. So he brought that perspective with him as well. But in essence, we talked about in the episode prior to that, the gender gap in cybersecurity careers, how women are vastly underrepresented. But also with his episode, we talked about how African Americans are underrepresented by quite a bit in cybersecurity careers as well. And, one of the reasons that's important is having other perspectives helps you to think like the people who are trying to cause you harm.
Right. And likely not quite enough time has passed since this episode that we can give a great update either one way or the other, but we can speculate a bit perhaps that this sort of change in remote working across the country might sort of lend itself to promoting more diversity hiring just because those markets are a little wider open at this point. You're able to apply for jobs in different regions where maybe in the past you didn't have access to that sort of job market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly possible. And I think progress has probably been incremental. I haven't really seen a lot of new numbers, but you've got to think that there's been a little movement in a positive direction there in general. I think anecdotally it feels that way, at least in cybersecurity careers, that we are seeing more female voices, more diverse voices, and people are at least talking about the need for that. So those should all be considered positive steps, at least.
Right. And maybe this is something we only see from our perspective as people that, read a lot of headlines and scour for these different groups online. But I feel like I have seen a lot of, as well, sort of pipelines being built in from education into the career path or from other industries sort of crossing over into the cybersecurity world. I'd also like to bring up the last couple months, especially, we're starting to see all these major attacks from threat actors, and really cybersecurity is being elevated to this geopolitical government kind of status where, I could very well see the government pushing for a very large surge in hiring over the next several years to try to fill in those defenses.
Yeah, there's definitely the one thing that we know hasn't changed is there's still a shortage of qualified people to take the cybersecurity careers on. We actually had a couple episodes ago talked about Purdue's program, which was a cyber apprenticeship training program, which again highlighted how there are a lot of different ways into the cybersecurity field. You don't necessarily need a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. You might be able to just do some training through your employer even to switch careers over to cybersecurity, doing some type of certificate or apprenticeship. So if you're listening and you're thinking, well, I just don't have the training, but I'd be kind of curious about working in the cybersecurity field, no matter what your background, you could maybe be doing it within a year if you can find that right training opportunity. Your employer may need people in that department, and they may be happy to subsidize that training too. So,
right, doesn't hurt to ask.
No, it doesn't hurt to ask. Certainly, a cost of training can be a barrier to entry. So, if you can find those opportunities, or if there are scholarships out there, those are things to definitely pursue.
Right, and when the need is this high, you'll for sure find some helping hand waiting to get you into the industry.
Yeah. So definitely the diversity problem has not been solved, but at least it's being talked about. You mentioned the pipeline groups as well. So Roderick had done a talk for Blacks in Cybersecurity. I know from doing the episode prior on the gender gap, there are women in cyber groups and things like that out there too. So yes, there are people within the industry, I think, who have maybe fought some of those fights to get there already that are really happy to share lessons that they've learned and mentor people to get into the field too. So one other last bit to consider if you may be from one of those underrepresented groups is to seek out people like you, and they're going to be generous in helping shepherd you into this career field. And so as we went on into the latter part of 2020, going into the fall, ransomware started to ramp up even more, getting towards where it stands now. One of the major targets, which even got an official FBI and CISA warning, was the healthcare industry. And Sonic Wall's Barbara Vibert explained why this was so serious in episode 32.
If a regional hospital or community hospital misses a billing cycle, it could put the entire operation itself in danger. In terms of the healthcare vertical, especially, these ransomware attacks and malicious attacks that deny availability of all kinds can put people's lives in danger. So the malicious actors think they have a better chance of extorting payment from hospitals and clinics than they do from other businesses because, as for example, if a hospital ER has to go on bypass, that is that they're not accepting patients because they're backlogged because they're having to use paper systems, for example, people can die. And it's not just the publicity. The people who work in healthcare really care about people being healthy and not dying. So that's looked as a way to make them more exploitable.
And the hospital and healthcare problem certainly hasn't been solved as of yet, but it's almost been, I feel like in recent months, pushed a little bit to the back burner because of some of the even more high-profile attacks that have occurred. But I think right around the time that we spoke with her for that episode was when we had that first report of an actual patient dying because of a ransomware attack.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that. I was thinking about it during the clip, whether she was saying all this knowing that somebody had just passed due to ransomware, or if this was very close after, I assume. That was in Germany, I believe, correct?
Yeah, it was in Germany when somebody was rushed to the hospital, but the hospital could not take her because they were a victim of a ransomware attack and were not accepting new patients. So she needed to go another hour away, and by then things had deteriorated as such that the patient was unable to make it. So I believe that it maybe just happened right before this episode was recorded, but certainly that was a real life example of plenty of other potential implications that can occur when hospitals and healthcare organizations in particular get attacked.
Yeah, and as you said, this issue's sort of taken a bit of a back burner. I haven't heard any particularly new stories, and any stories I have heard of healthcare industry being sort of disrupted in the last several months is more of a collateral damage for a much larger attack, as you said. So with SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange, we're getting these very high profile, so maybe the healthcare attacks aren't necessarily moved to the back burner so much as the rest of the kitchen is now on fire. So
yeah,
the front burner doesn't matter quite as much anymore.
Right. The healthcare attacks are going to be they're just going to be more localized, so they could still be happening. They might just not be getting the front page headlines because when you're talking about Colonial Pipeline, for instance, that impacts a huge chunk of the U.S. and the meat supplier, JBS, that got attacked. That could have impacted people's food supplies, lots of people's food supplies. So sometimes you don't hear necessarily about the hospitals anymore because, it could just be a one hospital or a 3-hospital group in an area that's not as populated. And again, if we don't know of a specific impact, like a patient death, for instance, I don't think the reporting is going to be quite as strong on that. But I highly doubt that they're now all of a sudden immune from cyber attacks.
Right, and another reason they could be a little less than they were at the time of this recording is just that a lot of the questions that were swirling out there with the pandemic and the vaccine have now been answered for the most part. So I'm sure as we see new variants and strains come out, the ransomware threat actors will seize on those. I'm assuming once, maybe a next wave of vaccines or booster shots, once that kind of stuff starts popping up in the news, we'll probably see exploits surrounding those. So maybe this is not so much that healthcare gets a reprieve so much as the bait's better on a different hook at the moment.
Yeah, and the other piece that happened during the pandemic was a lot of hospitals were running out of space and setting up remote areas, remote facilities, which we did discuss were really ripe for cyber attacks because they were not on the hospital network necessarily. So they were still connecting back to the network, but in less secure fashion just because it was a triage situation and they were not able to stand up security at the same time as standing up the actual functionality of these places. I don't think there's as much of that out there right now. So more of the hospital and healthcare records should be a little bit safer again back inside of the network. But, again, there's lots of possibilities for this to come up again.
Right.
And so moving ahead to January of this year, 2021, President Joe Biden was sworn into office, and we welcomed policy analyst Caitlin Chin to provide a glimpse into some potential cyber policy under the new administration, including Section 230 regarding liability protection for social media, which had already been discussed a little bit by the previous administration.
Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is a statute that has sort of faced criticism from both Republicans and Democrats in Congress, but for different reasons. So Democrats say that Section 230 sort of provides a legal defense for social media platforms to preserve content that is violent, misleading, or could interfere with democratic elections. Well, Republicans allege that this law empowers platforms to censor conservative voices. So it has faced a lot of controversy lately about content moderation and social media polarization. I do think that it will be a priority for Congress, but I think it's very unlikely for Biden to take sort of the same stance on Section 230 as Trump.
And this was episode 37, by the way. I did not include that in the intro. So starting off with the Section 230 side of things, it's, for some reason, people have not stopped talking about it since then.
Yeah, that's come up in a news article quite recently in which Donald Trump filed a lawsuit against, I guess, all of the social media. So Twitter, Facebook, I don't think LinkedIn was probably hooked in, but maybe next time.
Yeah.
Basically saying that he is being censored and trying to repeal these Section 230 protections in response.
Yeah, and there have also been stories about individual cases which Section 230 has come up in a couple of times this year. Courts actually found that the Section 230 protections did not apply. There's a case regarding Snapchat in which there's a Snapchat filter that encouraged basically people to drive faster, and a couple of people were killed in a car accident from driving too fast using a Snapchat filter, and the courts found that Snapchat would not be protected under Section 230 there. Facebook has also been under some fire in a Texas case regarding sex trafficking happening through the platform. And again, Section 230 protections found not to apply there. So it's weakened a little bit, I guess, in court cases so far this year. And lawmakers are still talking about it too.
Yeah, and just as Caitlin Chin said, there's a little bit from both sides of the aisles kind of pushing on this. What I guess I don't understand is if you believe you're being censored by one of these platforms, how would taking protection away stop that censorship? Wouldn't they be liable and then have to censor even more so?
Yeah, there's certainly that argument. I think the argument of censorship is that I think he wants to, or others, people who feel like they're being censored, want to be able to sue them for stopping them from getting their voices out there, basically. But yes, the reason behind the censorship is probably, related to worries about dangers, dangerous behavior connected to it.
I just feel like holding the platforms more accountable would just eventually end up in more censorship. Maybe only they get to post from now on.
Definitely could be a bit of a cycle there. But, pivoting to the rest of that episode, too, Caitlin was talking about some cyber policy priorities coming from the Biden administration. And of course, we've heard a lot from them over the last couple of months, largely connected to the fact that there have been some crazy big cyber attacks that have, brought in federal government response.
Yeah, so at the time of this story in this interview, there was a lot of, what will happen? What will he do one way or the other? And then suddenly we had a big old foot smash down on the gas pedal. And
yeah.
Surprisingly, we still haven't figured out what he's going to do. So
yeah, there was the executive order. There has been some policy, but we still haven't gotten to that point where there's like a real formalized cybersecurity bill that's going through Congress, and we don't know who would be supportive of all of the policies that are out there. But yeah, President Biden did sign an executive order, and there has been some activity relating to cybersecurity, largely with some reporting requirements and infrastructure places that will now have some new requirements that they didn't have before for reporting. But yeah, there's still a lot of gray area out there when it comes to cybersecurity policy. We just know that it's being talked about a lot more because there's a lot more high-profile attacks out there.
Yeah, I was going to say one big shift that sort of resulted in these huge attacks was that this graduated from a America issue to kind of a whole world issue at this point. So especially in this last week where we have a lot of NATO and EU countries coming forward to basically point the finger at China, which we'll talk about a little more in this episode. Yep. It seems that you now have multiple countries coming together and, drawing battle lines out, so to speak.
Yeah, we still have the countries who have been associated with cyber attacks in the past, not only China, but obviously we've talked about Russia quite a bit and the ransomware cells that are at least tangentially connected there. And we've talked recently about North Korea. And then, of course, there are just the independent groups out there that are targeting institutions that used to maybe be off limits in terms of infrastructure and food and schools and hospitals and all that stuff. So these types of places that are being affected now are beyond just, that's a business over there that we don't have to worry about so much.
Right. So definitely maybe in the end, this won't be resolved by legislation here at home, but more of a, international effort by a larger international entity.
Yep. That's plenty still to come with cybersecurity policy under the current administration. So that was the 5 clips that we went through and wanted to talk about here. There's, again, plenty more that we could talk about. And I did want to leave with one other little bonus clip that I thought would be kind of funny to listen to. After a few moments, he heard a familiar sound, this time twice, and headed out into the break room to discover a robed figure chomping away on the contents of some vending machine potato chips and sipping an RC Cola. I'm the ghost of Christmas present. Pull up a chair and have a ho-ho. Oh yeah, and touch my magical robes when you get a chance. I've got something to show you.
Touch your robes? Seems like a reasonable request from a mysterious stranger I've never met. All right, then, let's do this.
That was our original radio podcast play, Cybersecurity Christmas Carol back in Christmas of 2019. Just wonderfully voice acted, I think, by...
That's the hard part of this time of the year. We're so far away from the holiday episodes.
Yeah. Christmas in July, I guess. So if you are jonesing for a Christmas fix, we actually had special Christmas episodes both of the last 2 years. Yes, that was our voice acting debut, I would say, on Ping. And
screenwriting debut.
Yeah. So, just wanted to bring that up as a little capper as we look back at 49 previous episodes and celebrate episode number 50.
And hopefully you'll be with us for another Christmas and another 50 episodes.
Yep. Thank you all for listening. And now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at the top stories in the cybersecurity world and talk about what they may mean to you. Let's jump right into headline number 1. Return scams jump as fraudsters exploit e-commerce boom. So retailers say they're seeing a sharp increase in a type of return fraud in which consumers claim they never received their online orders, even though they did. So what is this kind of fraud called?
Well, it sounds pretty simple up front. The type of return fraud that you're speaking of here is the return scam, some people call it, but apparently there are actual professional fraudsters out there, not just doing this for themselves, but selling their services to others through social media and other platforms of such. Basically saying, hey, pay me and I will go defraud some large corporations on your behalf.
Yeah, it's an interesting scam, and it's actually got a name called item not received fraud, because basically what they do is say they never got the item that they ordered. And a lot of these large companies that ship said items out, like Amazon, Walmart, Target, many, many others, will take your word for it, and maybe they won't even request the item back. They'll just give you your money back.
Right. So a lot of these professional fraudsters are themselves either former customer reps or just sort of spend days in and out reading all the return policies for these different companies and sort of becoming experts on who they can scam and how. So, and most of the time, that's going to be items under $500, and usually the larger volume retailers like Amazon, Wal-Mart, Target, folks that probably won't take the time or the energy and effort it takes to root down something under $500. It's just not worth it for them.
Yeah. So that's an easy one right there. Basically, taking one step back, the whole process goes: a consumer places an online order with a retailer. After the package arrives, the consumer or the professional refunder, as referred to in the story, calls the retailer's customer service department and says they did not receive the package. And so it's pretty simple. It's not a very complicated scam, but apparently it works.
Right, and they can also get into some more details that can make it a little more convincing or a little more, I guess, likely to not get flagged. Mm-hmm. So, for example, they may be ordering a laptop and then claiming that the battery of that laptop was leaking upon arrival, because obviously a retailer won't ask you to put a broken lithium battery in the mail and send it back to them. So in that case, they'd rather just say, okay, here's your money back. So there are some more complicated and complex strategies, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and one of the common issues is to claim that, your package was never delivered, that it was delivered to the wrong address. And for the most part, during the pandemic, a lot of places were not requiring, and still are not requiring, signatures upon delivery. But even if they do require signatures, the professional refunders that we are referring to tell their proxies, I guess, to just scribble something or even use fake names when signing, just so that they can have that ready to go when they're claiming that they didn't receive the item.
Right. I think of all the things I've signed, which was just kind of a quick swipe of the pen and nothing more. Yeah. So maybe ripe for this particular type of fraud. Well, I guess I wouldn't be ripe, but if I started a company, I would.
Yeah, I know sometimes when you get deliveries that do require a signature, the person will ask your last name as well. So that's where that throwing in the fake name bit helps to add to the convincing nature of the scam here. But a couple of the companies that do the deliveries, FedEx and UPS, were quoted in this Wall Street Journal story. FedEx saying they investigate criminal activity and cooperate with authorities, and UPS saying the company uses a range of tools, including software that determines vehicle location at the drop-off point to crack down on fraud. And it did say that there has been an uptick that they've seen as well.
Yeah, and then other companies are going even simpler with like Finish Line and Under Armour now requiring customers to fill out an affidavit when their items don't arrive. They don't call it an affidavit because that's a big and scary legal term they don't want to put on their customers, but basically the idea being to add more loopholes, add more steps, and just kind of annoy fraudsters out of looking somewhere else, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And Amazon has really ramped up the practice of having their drivers take photos of the packages when they drop them off, too. So you're actually seeing a package sitting on someone's doorstep. I mean, yes, you could still then make some other claims based around that. And I don't know what the company's policies would be relating to the quote-unquote porch pirate phenomenon, where people will drive around a neighborhood and just steal boxes off of people's
really
porch.
No way to prove or disprove that happened unless you have a Ring camera.
Yeah. And so I don't know if that would fall under this type of refund fraud, if somebody would use that as a reason. Like, oh, well, you took a picture that it was there, but we didn't get it. So
right. No way to prove in that 1 or 2 hours where no one was watching it. But apparently this has gotten so popular that it's starting to create a competitive market for these fraudsters. So the going rates used to be about 15 to 30% of your total order value. That is now down to about 7% to 20% due to, as I said, competition in the field. So
free
a lot
market.
of fraudsters to choose from.
Yeah. And so, I mean, this is not exactly a cybersecurity story in the same tradition as most of them, but it still has to do with online behavior, online retailers, and online fraud. And, quoted in here is someone from Target's cyber fraud team, for example, saying they're aware of attempts to take advantage of the returns process and putting protections in place to detect and stop it. And there's a National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance listed here too, involved in helping to stop this kind of fraud. So yeah, this isn't malware being deployed or ransomware or a lot of the more common stories that we talk about here, but it's another example of how dangerous the online world can be. This time it's actually more for retailers, and if the retailers are dealing with this too much, then it becomes a problem for the customers who end up having to spend more or,
make up these losses. Yeah.
Fill out
one way or
affidavits.
the other.
Yeah. Now, headline number 2. Leaked NSO group data hints at widespread Pegasus spyware infections. Israeli-based NSO group is being blasted in a groundbreaking report that alleges that the company's controversial Pegasus malware is being used to target activists, journalists, business execs, and politicians in a widespread basis with a variety of exploits, including a zero-click, zero-day in the iOS operating system on Apple devices.
Yeah, that's a pretty scary combination of words you just said there at the very end. So not to jump too far ahead in this story, but just to expand on that particular point, as of July of 2021, the most recent attack that was observed was a multiple zero-day attack on a fully patched iPhone 12 running iOS 14.6. So about as up-to-date security-wise as you can get, and yet still multiple zero-day vulnerabilities being exploited here. So
yes,
this is pretty advanced stuff.
And when you say zero-click and zero-day together, yes. First of all, zero-click means you didn't do anything to bring this upon yourself. It's not a situation where you were tricked into clicking on something or downloading something or anything like that. The individual just had an iPhone, and so
that's all it took.
That's all it took. And the zero-day, obviously, as we've talked about before, also referred to a lot of times as never-before-seen threats. It means never been patched, never before seen, and combination of that and not being able to stop it by your own behavior is a recipe for disaster.
Right. So what exactly is this NSO group? It is a private company. It is, as far as anyone can tell, not a state-sponsored group. At least I didn't see that anywhere in any of these stories. Right. But I guess it sells a bit of what you would call spyware as a service, is what you'd say.
Yeah.
So they've got these programs which let you keep an eye on your competitors, or I guess whoever you would like to in this case.
Right.
They say it's made for companies, I believe, but
yes.
in a lot of these cases it is instead being sold to government entities in order to track dissidents, journalists, activists, and so forth.
Yes, including even, according to this report, connecting to Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who of course was killed a couple of years back. So yeah, this is some pretty serious stuff here.
Yes, so this Pegasus is also able to read encrypted messages in both WhatsApp and Telegram, as well as Signal, all three of which are touted as being secure ways to communicate. So obviously not that secure in light of this particular attack.
Yes, so the dissidents or whoever the targets of the companies or governments that are using this spyware happen to be, they get malware infected on their phones. Not always this particular zero-click, zero-day situation with iOS. It's different stuff. But basically, yes, they can have their encrypted messages read. The leak that we're talking about in this overarching story that was done by a group of journalists and published in the Guardian newspaper has more than 50,000 mobile phone numbers worldwide that the firm was storing. So not all of them were directly spied on, according to the story, but some of them were. And yes, some of that spying was pretty extensive.
And Amnesty's security lab examined 67 phones that they believed had been targeted by this malware and found that more than half of them did have traces of Pegasus activity. So out of this 50,000 plus mobile phone numbers, you can probably bet a pretty good amount of them have in fact seen some Pegasus activity.
Yes, and this 50,000 goes back to 2016, so about a 5-year or so period, and the zero-click zero-day attacks had been observed since May of 2018. So we're talking about a lot of stuff happening here.
So the NSO group, of course, says that this is not being used for any nefarious purposes and that its spying tools are solely meant to help law enforcement fight criminals and terrorists. Ironically, you also have a separate report of a new hacking group out there with a malware dubbed Demon Tongue that's been used for very similar purposes, and they also claim that they are being used only for combating terrorism and criminals.
Yes, interesting that they got their stories so aligned there. Also, the NSO group claims that the report's conclusions are based on uncorroborated theories that are based on misleading interpretation of leaked data. So basically, they're acknowledging that data is there. They're just saying it's not there for maybe the bad reasons that
it's not what it looks like.
Yeah. I'm not really sure how you would interpret them having all of this information if it was not, directly from their own customers. So there are definitely some follow-up questions to ask there, I think. And
I think we'll be hearing about this story again here in a month or two.
I think we will. And as we've talked about, if you're online, you've probably been hacked in some way, shape, or form already.
Yep.
Headline number 3. U.S. and global allies blame China for widespread cybercrime, including massive Microsoft Exchange hack. So in a move that could have serious repercussions for the U.S.-China relationship, American cyber officials blame hackers tied to the Chinese government for one of the largest cyber attacks in U.S. history, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago, that whole Microsoft Exchange hack.
Right, so according to senior administration officials, the FBI and NSA have high confidence that these hackers were contracted by China's Ministry of State Security, so finally tying this group to a Chinese state-sponsored entity. So I had pretty high confidence all along, but this is, I suppose, the official recommendation.
And a lot of times you never actually do hear it coming out officially from the government, even though they probably know that already too. Mm-hmm. So this is certainly, there's always some calculation involved as to whether they will publicly call out another government for this kind of activity. But in case you missed this one of the gazillion crazy huge breaches over the past couple of months, this one was the attack carried out on the Microsoft Exchange email server this spring that exposed tens of thousands of private and public U.S. entities, including schools, hospitals, cities, and pharmacies, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And we didn't really see too much actually come of it other than that exposure occurred.
Right. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if this was a super successful attack, even if it was the largest, unless there's another level that we're not quite seeing yet. But senior officials of the Biden administration claim that China's Ministry of State Security often uses criminal contract hackers to conduct quote-unquote unsanctioned cyber operations globally. So there's that one half layer of probable deniability there.
Yeah, but this cyber attack was, on the heels of SolarWinds and all that. We're still hearing experts in the field talking about this being like the biggest hack they'd ever seen. This is crazy huge in scope and, just everybody being exposed in this case. And again, it turned out not to be maybe quite as serious because we didn't have ransoms and things getting shut down based on it, but more just having that exposure out there was pretty big. And we talked about worldwide exposure. The U.S. was joined by allies, including Australia, Canada, Japan, the UK, New Zealand, and the EU, calling out the Chinese government for this behavior.
Yes, and in response, the Chinese government said, no. They firmly oppose and combat cyber attacks and cyber theft in all forms, as the official statement. So you might wonder how something this large, as we sort of talk about it, is not that big of a deal in the end. So David Kennedy, CEO of cybersecurity firm TrustedSec, said that it is literally the largest hack he's seen in his lifetime, but there was really no rhyme or reason behind it. It was kind of just a chaotic smash and grab. So once the initial chaos settles, seems everything just kind of got pushed off the table and we can reset it and it'll be fine.
And again, this could be one of those more intelligence gathering kind of things to see if they could do it and then maybe get some intel on some of the places that they were able to get into. But yeah, it may be more of a long game kind of thing, and we'll see if it leads to worse things in the future. But this was something that came pretty early on after the hack. Microsoft came out and blamed a, quote, state-sponsored threat actor that they called Hafnium, and explained in a blog post that Hafnium operates from China, and it was the first time that they were discussing its activity. It's a highly skilled and sophisticated actor. So right off the bat, Microsoft was pretty much saying it's a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group. But
for geopolitical reasons, they can't point quite that big a finger.
Yeah.
So China seems to have a slightly different relationship with its state-sponsored hackers than our traditional Russian hackers that we've talked about in this show quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Russian hackers, that relationship can be a bit tenuous and shadowy. It seems that the connection between the Chinese government and their hackers is a bit more like contract work. So it's a little more coordinated, so to speak, or at least supposedly coordinated, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes,
the
throw
Chinese,
those words in there.
Yes, we have to legally throw all those words in there. And the Chinese hackers tend to avoid detection by routinely rotating through a number of sort of small office, home office routers and virtual private servers and networks like that. So
yeah,
very hard to trace.
Yeah, but we do hear about the ties to Russia among a lot of ransomware groups in particular, and I guess the way the system works there has allowed the government a little bit more plausible deniability than the way that the U.S. is describing the Chinese system here, where it looks like literally people are getting paid from the government to carry out these attacks. The Russian government doesn't seem to be quite as brazen about how it happens, though we also, I would say, see a lot more activity out of there. So there's something going on there too, I think.
Plausible deniability. That is the phrase I could not figure out earlier. Let's go ahead and drop that in an edit.
Well, that's what we're here for.
Right.
Thanks very much for listening to this 50th episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. And thanks very much to Shannon Emmons,
Jaime Ortiz,
Chris McCormack,
Mark Liliberty,
Daniel Kramers,
Douglas Santos,
Anthony Merchot,
Brooke Chelmo,
Ben Boland,
Mike Weaver,
Matt Brennan,
Ryan Orsey,
Brooke Chelmo,
Daniel Krimmers,
Sundar Sankaran,
Mike Weaver again,
Nir Shitri,
Roderick Chambers,
Donna Grindle,
David Sims,
Amy McLaughlin,
Brooke Chelmo,
Anthony Merchot,
Jim Richburg,
James Stanley,
Barbara Vibbert,
Dan Lorman,
Mark Liliberty,
Caitlin Chin,
Rebecca McEwen,
Anthony Merchot,
Brooke Chelmo,
Cynthia Brumfield,
Ax Sharma,
Emma Schroeder,
Trey Herr,
Mark Rogers,
Aaron Chin,
Shane Davis,
and Jamie McCall for joining us.
Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available, and please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs, and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for listening to the first 50, and for Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, probably episode 51. But in the meantime, we remind you to
get secure, stay secure.